Podcasting from Portland East to Portland West, from Big Pine Key to Pacific Beach, and from San Juan to Guam, this is All Across America. Beverly, welcome to All Across America.
It's great to be here.
So excited to have you. You're a professor of history at Yale University, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, and most recently, the author of This Land Is Your Land, a road trip through U.S. history. I had a lot of fun reading it. I guess I can imagine you had a lot of fun putting this one together.
I did. That was part of the point of writing this book. You know, history professors often sit alone in their offices thinking about dead people. And I wanted to get out on the road and meet some actually living people and see how they're thinking about history.
I don't often ask authors about their process and getting a publisher and all that, but this one is about a road trip. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about how many road trips you took, how many years it took, how you decided where you wanted to go and write about.
I started working on this book in early 2023. So my first trip was to Texas, because I was going there anyway. And this was right after I had published a big book about the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover. And I was still working out exactly what my method was going to be at that point. As it turned out, this book has 13 chapters. It's called A Road Trip Through U.S. History, but because of my own life and my own schedule, I couldn't actually take off 6 or 7 months in a row to go do it. So I did 13 different journeys, one for each chapter. And so each of those was a road trip unto itself, but it was not one seamless journey.
Wow. Okay. I like the linear nature of it. 13 chapters, 13 road trips. I mean, did you plan it that way or did it just end up 13 columns? I mean, I don't know. It looks like it fell together perfectly.
It fell together mostly on its own. I came to think that these were the places that wanted to be written about, but I always knew that I wanted to write 250 years of American history through a series of road trips and journeys to historic sites. The idea that each one of these chapters would be both a place and a moment in time emerged as I was doing the traveling. I had thought maybe I was going to go everywhere in the country and do everything. And it turns out you can't really do that, especially if you want to make a deadline like 2026. And I very much wanted it to be in conversation with this moment, the semi-quincentennial.
And here we are. And you write a couple of things. One, it says it's possible, at this juncture that we are in American history, thinking about our semi-quincentennial, the 250th birth, since independence. You said it's possible to know your history and still love your country. And I think a lot of it is understanding how history was made, how history has been compiled, and how history has been rethought. And I guess what you're saying is it's okay to rethink history and to have a different understanding and still understand the United States and still love what the American experiment is and is still enduring and trying to be.
That's exactly right. I was really troubled when I started out, and I think still today, at this divide that we have in our historical discourse, where either you're a patriot and you love your country, or you think that, the United States is the worst. And that's what it really means to be a thinking person, is to only think about its flaws and injustices. And it seemed to me that that's not really how history works. It's not all villains and not all heroes. And it's also, I think, not especially productive for our political discourse to have that kind of division either. So I went into this really as a challenge to myself to try to tell a big sweeping story about 250 years of American history, but also to kind of lean into the tension between those two ways of thinking about history. Because to me, history is full of mobility and dynamism and change and unexpected things and contingency. And so it just doesn't make any sense to have those two ways of thinking about it. But I think we're still a little bit stuck in that today. Hopefully my book will nudge, if not, radically transform this historical discourse.
Yeah. I mean, so much in life is not black and white, left or right, one direction or the other. Sometimes it's so much a balance of, somewhere in the middle, which I think sometimes can be, I don't know, a little boring. I mean, maybe there can be more passion on one side versus the other, but I think it's many things in life are much more nuanced than just one interpretation direction versus the other. But you did write, which I thought was really important for me, and I hadn't heard this before. But you wrote that historians tend to be myth busters.
Right. Well, particularly in academic history, right, inside universities and colleges, a lot of what you're rewarded for is saying the new thing. And that's great. That's how new ideas develop. That's where new insight comes from. But it then does tend to bias everyone toward, I've taken down this old myth of the past and I've told you the truth. And now we know the truth and we can get rid of those old myths. And there's a lot of productive part of that, but it does tend to mean that we're throwing out a lot of things that we don't need to throw away.
Yeah, and uh, this I think particularly the park rangers and some of the national historic sites, some of the recent reductions in staff, the reinterpretations, the disallowance of negative views of American history. Did you see that in your travels? I know some of those were in 2023, 2024. Had you got an inkling of that? Where do you see that going, and how might that change, or how might that permanently inflect upon how history is presented?
It is really one of the tragedies of this 250th birthday that it's being used to defund these institutions that do public history, to try to control them, to try to distort the history that they're telling, to contrast that with the bicentennial. The bicentennial in 1976 produced this huge wave of investment in history, in public history sites, in new ways of thinking about history and bringing new groups and ideas in. And so this really is a radical opposite of that. And it's I think a real shame because these moments don't come along all that often. I did most of my traveling, as you said, in 2023 and 2024. So that was a different presidential administration. The signs were not up at the National Park Service, but I think the basic contours of the history wars were already in play. You could already see that. So it wasn't a huge surprise to me when that happened. And actually, one of the challenges of writing this book is that things are changing so fast in this realm. So already some of the places that I saw just a few years ago look quite different now, some of them for better, some of them for worse. But history is not a thing that sits still.
No, no, and my sense in just understanding history, and maybe I had maybe a too simplistic understanding of history, and I think maybe many folks in the same way think that history is just a recitation of facts, but it's more a recitation of facts, but then an interpretation of those facts. And of course, the facts could be the victor. There's the old adage that the victor writes history, and I guess those interpretation of facts can be very different depending on if it's the bicentennial, there is semi-quincentennial, or I guess it'll be called the tricentennial in 50 years. I mean, how has that changed in 50 years, the interpretation of facts, and how do you see it changing 50 years from now?
You're right that history is very much a fact-based discipline, and you can't do history without the facts. So it is nonfiction as best we can tell. But of course, you're always working with incomplete records. There are things you want to know that you're never going to be able to know, especially the further back you go in history. But history is also an art. It is also a process of interpretation. And that's as it should be. It's really a conversation between the present and the past. So historians hate presentism, which is when people in, say, the 21st century see something in their own society and they go back and say it was exactly the same. It's always been here. That can be too much cherry picking. But there's this very dynamic relationship between the kinds of things that we want to know from our past in a whole variety of presents. And of course, that changes over time. It would be really boring to be a historian if you didn't get to rethink some of the things that had been laid down years earlier.
Let's jump into the journey, and maybe you could start with a place that you really loved that you thought was, a fascinating combination of history and fun.
I loved so many places that I went to, so that's a very difficult question. But I guess one that comes to mind is the River Rouge facility in Dearborn, Michigan. The book starts in the 1770s, with the American Revolution in Philadelphia. But a lot of the stuff that I think people don't go to as much are these 20th century sites. And one of those is the River Rouge, which was Henry Ford's kind of pièce de résistance, his masterpiece, the world's largest industrial facility in the 1920s. And you can still go visit. Ford still owns many parts of it. They still make the F 150 there. And so it's really this glorious example of American industrial innovation. And those are pretty hard to find. So I thought the River Rouge was really quite stunning, even though the actual tour with Ford it's basically like being in a Ford commercial.
Right.
So I wouldn't say it's the world's greatest history, but the place is
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah. And that is Ford's original factory located in Dearborn, Michigan?
That's right. So it wasn't his first factory, but in the 1920s, when he was becoming the richest man in the world, was the undisputed kind of king of American industry, he decided he was going to build the River Rouge and it was going to do everything. You were going to kind of bring in raw lumber, raw steel, and then you were going to process everything, and out the door was going to come a finished Model T. And so it was just this amazing thing. It's a mile or more than a mile long. It's got all of these interlocking pieces. So it was a feat of organization, of industry, and then, of course, it became, like many places in American industry, also a place of real labor battles. And so it's got
Yes.
a whole really interesting labor history associated with it, too.
And you mentioned in the book of all the historic sites the United States has, there's nothing dedicated to the American worker.
It was very interesting being on the road and seeing the kinds of things that, in general, we like to talk about, and then the pieces that are missing. And this history of labor, the history of work, even the history of American industry is a little bit missing. There are, of course, museums of American industry, but they tend to be, about sort of scientific discovery and fun gadgets and such. But the actual kind of economic might of the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century, and particularly what that meant for American workers, for ordinary people. You can see little glimpses of it out there, but it's really understated in how we think about our history.
Well, maybe we could talk a little bit about Eugene Debs, and for folks that don't know him, who was he and why is he such an important figure in history?
Eugene Debs was another great site. I did a chapter on Chicago that tries to look at the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. So that period in the late 19th and early 20th century, when industry is on the rise. It's an age of mass immigration, when big cities like Chicago are really just coming into being. But in order to capture the history of some of the more radical pieces of resistance to all of this, or wanting to shape it, or workers' control, or labor, I went about 4 hours south to Terre Haute, Indiana, where there's this little place called the Eugene Debs House. And what makes it really interesting is that Debs was the leader of American socialism, the American socialist movement, throughout that whole period, really starting in the 1890s and extending all the way to the 1920s. That's one of the few places you can go to visit to find out that history. And Debs is this very interesting, charismatic figure because he's this kind of corn-fed Midwestern boy who gets radicalized. And, then by 1919, he's saying, I'm a Bolshevik from, the top of my head to the tips of my toes. And so he's a real American-born left-wing revolutionary.
And you, in your introduction to the chapter on Chicago, you talked about how up to that point, the history of America had been, I guess, the history of the West and the frontier. And then Chicago, it became about the industrialization of the country. Where are we now? Are we still considered the experience economy?
Right. Well, I think post-industrial is a word that's been around for a while, but it doesn't really quite capture because, of course, there is so much stuff going on in the United States. And in fact, one of the things that's particularly interesting about this moment is that with AI and the infrastructure that's being built around AI, in some ways, it looks a lot like all of the railroad building that went on in the 1860s and 1870s, right? That was kind of the big infrastructure investment of its moment. Now, that's both good news and bad news. The railroads did do a lot to kind of transform the economy. They also led to a pretty brutal cycle of boom and bust. So you'd have overinvestment and then collapse, and then overinvestment and collapse. It's one of the things that was really hard on American working people in the late 19th century was you would have these periods of, incredible opportunity and then mass unemployment, and you were sort of yo-yoing back and forth between those.
Yeah, the boom and the bust, I mean, that's so much of the history of the American West. I mean, up until this day, you look at, Las Vegas, for instance. And speaking of the West, I mean, you've gone from the Liberty Bell to Disneyland. And, where does pop culture play into American history? Where does commerce play? I mean, I often say to folks, and you did mention how you had left Graceland chapter out of the book. I often mention to folks visiting this country to visit a Walmart, as I see it as
Mm.
the paragon of, both capitalism and the stuff that we have as Americans. I mean, what area of the country? I mean, I do feel like Orange County is, at least from the 1950s to the early 2000s, was a great microcosm of the country.
Yeah, like any good road trip, it does begin in on one coast and end on the other. So it starts in Philadelphia and it ends in Southern California, largely in Orange County. And that's for a few reasons. I mean, Orange County was this fascinating, incredibly fast-growing, vibrant place in the middle of the 20th century. And Southern California was both producing American culture, American popular culture, certainly coming out of Hollywood and the Los Angeles area. But Orange County in particular was also producing new kinds of conservative politics. And we today tend to think about California as this very blue state. But in this period, it was really quite divided. The North was busy producing all these left wing movements, but the South really was a hotbed of modern conservatism, produced people like Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon. And Disneyland was interesting to me because it was right at the intersection of those two things, of this world of popular culture and American myth making, and then also, to some degree, kind of in this conservative cultural view of the United States, what it was supposed to be, and where it was coming from.
I mean, it's interesting to see how even a place like Disneyland has evolved. And I was just at Disneyland last month, 2 months ago. We were talking before the show started how I visited many of the places in this book, and it's why it had stuck out so much to me. But even the classic ride Splashdown has been re-envisioned as, is it Tiana's? But it was, maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Right, Splash Mountain is one of the places at Disney where the kind of history wars, political contests have emerged. So Splash Mountain, I believe it opened in the 1980s or so, but it was based on a Disney film from the 1940s called Song of the South that even in its release in the 1940s was this incredibly controversial movie. Lots of civil rights groups protested it because it gave a sort of romantic view of the 19th century South as a place of racial happiness and of you had all sorts of joyous, formerly enslaved people there telling wild stories, right? So it was a lot of racial stereotyping. And even in the 1940s, there were big protests against it. But Walt Disney himself loved that movie. Splash Mountain was built around that movie, although, mostly it's just like Brer Rabbit and other characters. It would be hard to kind of read all the politics of the movie into the ride. But because those politics continue to change sometime in the 2020s. I think right after 2020, Disney announced that it was going to retire this ride and reinvent it, which is itself, part of the process of making and engaging history. And I do think Disneyland, though people don't tend to go to Disneyland saying, I'm going to learn history lessons, it is a place because Walt Disney himself was so engaged with history, because the kind of DNA of Disneyland is about these stories of American history. I think it is one of the most influential historic sites in the United States at this point.
Definitely. And also in Orange County is Richard Nixon and the library of Richard Nixon. I wanted to bring this up because just last week, the Obama Presidential Library had its grand opening. What was that like as a historian visiting the library of a much maligned president who had to resign? And it does seem like 50 years later, at least they tried to re-envision some of his qualities. I mean, he did create the Environmental Protection Agency.
Right. Yeah, Nixon is one of these presidents who's been through really wild reputational changes. And that was true actually during his career, because he had a very long political career before he became president. And certainly it's been true since Watergate, and then especially since his death. And so the Nixon Library, which is part of the presidential library system, is really at the heart of that, I would say, almost reputational confusion.
Mm.
Nixon actually did accomplish quite a lot as president. He, made the opening to China. He created the Environmental Protection Agency. He ended the Vietnam War, albeit not very successfully. He, presided over all of these kind of dynamic changes in American society. But then, of course, Watergate, quite rightly, really looms over everything. And so the Nixon Library is mostly about, all the things that Nixon managed to do and managed to accomplish. And one of the funny things to me about visiting it is that I would say it leans even a little bit more into the idea that Nixon was kind of a domestic policy liberal when it comes down to it. But it's also got now a big serious room about Watergate. But those were hard fought battles, even within the world of Nixon and his fans who wanted to create the presidential library.
And not too far away on the other side of Los Angeles is Simi Valley, where Reagan's presidential library is located. What was that like visiting that library versus Nixon? And maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your next book while we're at it.
Right. So I am just getting started. Having finished this book, have to move on to the next one. And that is going to be a biography of Ronald Reagan. And one of the reasons that I was interested in writing about Reagan is because his life has this very long arc over the course of the 20th century. And so he's interesting in his own right. But for me, he's also a way to kind of tell the story of the 20th century, and in particular, struggles over communism and anti-communism that were so central to almost everything that he did, and were so central to the politics of that era. But now I think we're in a different moment, and it can be hard to recapture what everyone was so worked up about in, say, the 1950s and 60s. And so Reagan's actually a good vehicle for that. Gets to the end of the Cold War. His library, unlike Nixon's, is not ambivalent at all about Ronald Reagan. It really is a place that is one big long tribute to Reagan. But as I said, his life is so interesting because he is in the fray really from the 1940s and 50s onward. We tend to think of him as this product of the 1980s and the big figure of the 80s, and that's right. But his life history is really fascinating. And his library kind of sits alone atop this grand hill in Simi Valley, California. And anyway, it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun to visit.
He's been out of office for decades, and it feels like this is a really good time to write about him. Is there any rule of thumb for a historian? I mean, I guess there's living history, but is there a rule of thumb for an historian on how long should pass before looking back upon a subject? Or is there no rule and it's every 50, 100? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I don't there's no hard and fast rule for sure. I think the informal rule is that it's usually about 30 years,
Okay.
before you have enough distance and also before all the records from that time period start to open. So after something happens, right, it still has a lot of charge and people don't wanna give up their records, but as people get older and they say, "Okay, I'm gonna hand over my diaries or all the stuff in my attic to some library so that you can go look at it."
Is it easier to write about parts of history when those are involved or alive or dead?
Well, I think each have their challenges. I mean, things that don't seem to have a lot of currency in our moment, but that had a lot of currency in the past, that can be really interesting because you're telling people something really new, giving a different way of looking. But then, of course, you have to persuade them that it matters. When there's something that is still kind of living history or some set of issues that's hot and controversial in the day, that often can bring eyeballs to the history as well. But then people are coming with all sorts of preconceived notions. And so sometimes they sit there and say, well, that's not what I already thought. And so therefore, I think this is terrible. So I think it can go both ways. And also writing about famous people versus writing about people who are lesser known or experiences that are lesser known. You have some tension there too along the same lines.
In the book, you wrote about one of the most important questions in the country's history when it comes to race: is the United States a land of change or continuity? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm going to give the unsatisfying historian answer, which is, of course, that it is both. And there are some deep continuities that you can trace back to slavery, to the very earliest days of slavery, about racial ideas, racial hierarchies, that really did become absolutely building blocks of the United States. At the same time, there have been movements, transformations. I mean, we live in a fundamentally different world on these questions than even 2 or 3 generations ago, even though racism itself, either kind of day to day racism or structural racism, certainly hasn't disappeared. But I guess I get a little frustrated with a nothing ever changes view. But I also get frustrated with it's all been one grand story of progress and we're heading toward nirvana in some way.
Unfortunately, neither the balance question, it doesn't invite the clickbait that folks sometimes want. It is, and that is, as you put, unsatisfying, but the right answer in the right way, I think, to look at a lot of things. I thought about figures in the United States history, and folks think of Lincoln and Washington and Jefferson, but I think somebody who could really encapsulate the challenges of American history would be Sally Hemings and his relationship to Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, well, for people who want to learn about Sally Hemings in more depth than I will be able to offer here, I highly recommend a visit to Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's plantation in Virginia, as well as the works of Annette Gordon Reed, who is really the historian who brought out the Sally Hemings story and gave it depth and gave it life. Sally Hemings was an enslaved woman who had a relationship with Thomas Jefferson from the time that she was about 16, a sexual relationship. She bore him 6 children. And right now at Monticello, that relationship between Jefferson and Hemings, it's hard to even know what kind of word to use to describe it because she was his legal property. And so that relationship really is at the center of how Monticello tries to wrestle with these fundamental contradictions of the founding of the United States as they were embodied in Thomas Jefferson in particular. Here is the same person who is penning the Declaration of Independence, who we consider sort of the father of religious freedom and other big, important political ideas about human liberty and human happiness, who nonetheless owned more than 600 people over the course of his lifetime, had this lifelong relationship with an enslaved woman who he never emancipated. And one of the interesting things about their story is that it appears that Sally Hemings, when she was this 16-year-old girl living in Paris with Thomas Jefferson, made a deal with him in which she agreed to go back to Virginia with him. She could have stayed in Paris. And at that moment, that meant she could petition for her freedom and become a free woman in Paris. But she went back to Virginia with Thomas Jefferson, bore his children. But it seems she made a deal pretty early on that when he died, her children would be freed. And they are really basically the only people that Thomas Jefferson ever emancipated from slavery.
Wow. So in other words, 1% of his 600 enslaved people.
Right. Now, George Washington did something very different. So he also was a major slave owner. You can learn a lot about this if you visit Mount Vernon, which is another one of these key historic sites to go to. Washington, partly because he died earlier than Jefferson in the 1790s, when the idea of manumission, emancipation had a little more currency right after the American Revolution. So he did, at least in a partial way, actually free the enslaved people who had been his legal property upon his death.
And you used the word in the book that I had never heard before, manumission. What does that mean, and what's the difference between that and emancipation?
Well, it's sort of a technical difference. So manumission just meant sort of individual slave owners. It's what the slave owner would do in order to change the legal status of a person who was enslaved, who was his legal property. So that's what it was usually called. Of course, when Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War engages in emancipation, that's the Emancipation Proclamation. That's more political. And in some ways, it's a word that has a lot more kind of liberty in it. People tend to speak about enslaved people who left the plantation, ran away, went off seeking freedom, either as freedom seekers or as self-emancipated. But manumission is the kind of private freeing.
Now, who runs Monticello? Is that run by the federal government, or is that private entity?
It's not. So most of those sites in Virginia, but a lot of historic sites around the country are run by private foundations. And that's true of Monticello. It's true of Mount Vernon. It's true of Andrew Jackson's Hermitage in Tennessee. And that is interesting for what it does for those sites. So in certain ways, because their origins really were in these private foundations that venerated their subjects, right, wanted to hold up Washington or Jefferson or Jackson as these great men, these places still have a little bit of that flavor, although they each do it differently. But right now, actually being privately owned and not subject to or a recipient of federal money or federal control is actually an incredibly valuable thing. And so in many ways, it's those private sites that are able to engage really forthrightly in these questions about slavery and race and indigenous dispossession in a way that there are more restrictions now at the National Park Service. The Smithsonian, which has federal money and origins, is under a lot of pressure. And so I think that ebbs and flows, and there are advantages and disadvantages to each.
And it sounds like there can be a lot more reckoning at some of these private sites. You write about Montpelier, another presidential home. Was it of Monroe?
James
Madison,
Madison.
forgive me.
Yeah.
And how they've gone through multiple executive directors, multiple board members. How has that played out?
Well, I'm not sure what the latest news is from Montpelier, but it's an interesting place. So James Madison, one of the great authors of the Constitution, of Federalist Papers, all of these original ideas that shaped the country, as well as, of course, a president of the United States somewhat later. His estate in Virginia. His plantation was actually a private home for a very, very long time until the late 20th century when it was turned into a historic site that's now run by a foundation. And partly because of that lateness, there are all of these debates about, what do you do when you get something like this in the 21st century? What do you do? How do you tell that story? Is this primarily a story about Montpelier as a place of enforced mass slave labor? Is it primarily about Madison and his big ideas about the Constitution? And so Montpelier, more than most places, has just had to contend with that and has really clashed head on and has had lots of upheaval around exactly those questions.
So, talking about clash and upheaval, are there any of these sites, these historic sites that have had the least amount of upheaval, or that is just kind of it as you see it sort of interpretation? I mean, what is the least controversial of all these sites?
The least controversial. Wow. I mean, in some ways, honestly, it might be Independence Hall because while people have, sort of changed their views of the founding and all these things, nonetheless, there's a kind of script to Independence Hall. Independence Hall is still the building that it was during the Revolution, and so there has been, in some sense, a conversation that's swirled around Independence Hall. But I think the actual experience of going there, talking about the Declaration, talking about the Constitution, has been remarkably consistent for a remarkably long time.
And you write about all the school children on trips that have, been seen the Liberty Bell and Independence Hall, and I myself have done this. You wrote about your upbringing in suburban Philadelphia and seeing the bicentennial parade. What's your hope for the 250th and the celebrations and looking forward?
Well, I think the 250th is a hard moment for a lot of people. There is an impulse to mark the moment. I think there's a lot of ambivalence about what you're supposed to celebrate about the United States in this particular moment. So I will say I have admired people who have had the ambition to do something big for the 250th because I think compared to past moments like this, it's really been quite subdued. I don't know that I personally would have chosen a UFC fight in front of the White House, but actually, I'm not totally opposed to the energy that said, let's do something big, let's do something fun, let's do something kind of spectacular because I think a lot of what people have done is turned away from the 250th. So I guess my biggest hope is that whether you like what's going on in Washington in this moment or not, people actually take a longer view of American history, find the pieces of it that really are worthy of at least learning from, I would say celebrating. Is not going to be everything, and it's not going to be the same for everyone. But thinking about yourself and how your own history fits into the history of this nation, right? It's just a really important moment for marking that. And I would say of having a little bit of fun too. I worry that as a history professor, history is so fraught in this moment that a lot of people hear, oh, here's a history lesson. And they say, no, I don't. And so this book was an attempt to engage some serious history, but also really have some fun with it along the way, because I think that's part of what helps people stay connected to a living past.
And maybe we can talk about foreigners. We're in the middle of the World Cup, and we've had people coming from all over the world, and the reaction has largely been very positive, and the folks coming from abroad have been fascinated with everything from ranch dressing to the amount of choice that's available in stores to our huge air-conditioned stadiums. How do you think people across the world are seeing America now, and what has historically been the version of America that foreigners see and believe?
Yeah, it's been really fascinating to watch this and that reaction, so many appliances, so much air conditioning, so many cars, like, look at all the stuff in stores is is a reaction that has been of long standing. One of my favorite examples of that was Leon Trotsky, one of the architects of the Bolshevik Revolution. Right before the revolution, he didn't know the revolution was coming, was in exile, and he ended up in the Bronx. And so he was actually living in the Bronx when the Bolshevik Revolution got started. And in his memoirs, written years later, he's like, wow, the apartments were so big and they had these refrigerators. It was all about, American consumer society, which obviously, as a Bolshevik, he was not ultimately thinking that this was, the model for what a good society does. But even Leon Trotsky was like, this is pretty comfortable. I kind of like this. So, I think there are a lot of ways in which the United States is in a very, very difficult moment for its global reputation, both in terms of what the administration is doing, the wars, the tariffs, right? I don't need to list all of that off. It seems, as someone who teaches at a university, that a lot of what's going on in American immigration policy and the targeting of foreign students at universities really has put a damper on the idea that the United States is a welcoming place. But then I think you get these actual interactions on the ground, and so you're seeing all of these displays of openness and curiosity and welcome that have been really interesting. A couple of weeks ago, I was at the Greenbrier Hotel in West Virginia, which is an interesting historic site in its own right. But the Iraqi national soccer team was staying there as well, and we didn't get much of a chance to talk to them. But I was sort of thinking, what do they think of West Virginia? Right. And it's a fascinating question.
And maybe it's so hard for people to conceptualize the United States in some respects. I mean, I'm thinking of, Iraqis coming to the United States and going to West Virginia, which is a fascinating state, and we've covered on the show here. Very mountainous state. The geography is so different. It's a poorer state. How has your travels across the country helped you understand so much of America is related to geography?
Well, it might seem obvious, but I think one of the things that road tripping does is remind you how big this country is. So it takes a long time to drive across the country, even if you're trying to do it fast. But the sheer expanse and diversity of the United States is something that really hits you when you're out road tripping. It's very different from reading or flying or watching something on a screen, right? You don't get that same kind of experiential sense of both the bigness and the vast range of geographies and peoples and histories that is part of the United States. I'd say one thing that driving really reminded me was that in a lot of parts of this country, the United States, at least geographically, is still basically a place of farms and churches. So the church is going to be what you encounter, even not the Walmart, right? but the church. And so, how different are some of these places from what they were a century ago? And that is, of course, what you find through geography rather than population. It gives you a different story there. And you can also see, I think, in a different way, the kind of extremes of wealth and poverty, but also of economic fortune more broadly. Some places I went to, say Texas, which you already mentioned, I went there to think about the 1830s and 1840s, the moment when Texas rebels from Mexico, becomes its own country for a little while, then becomes part of the United States, and then ultimately the United States engages in war with Mexico for so much of the territory that is now the West and Southwest. And, but it was interesting because I was there focused on the 1830s and 1840s when there's basically not very much
Right.
not very much in Texas. And now we have these huge boom towns there, right? Some of our largest cities. Whereas in other places, I was coming to them trying to study their moment of economic success. So Detroit in the 1920s and 1930s is just this booming, massive place. And now it's a place of deep decline. And so you can see all of the dynamism of that and the different geographies as well as histories that emerge when you're traveling the country that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about, places like Texas in the 1830s, but where history is really being made right now and, just the drive from Austin to San Antonio, having taken that many times, in just 5 years, I saw how it went from very rural stretches in the middle of that hour and a half long trip to basically becoming one jumbled suburban sprawl from Austin to San Antonio.
Right, right. It's the land of random developments, right?
Yes.
And you're just kind of driving and there's nothing, and then there's all
Yeah.
sorts of development. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. Texas is not known for its zoning laws, which for better or worse, it
For better and worse in this moment, right? Yeah.
And what are your one state that the book didn't touch on was Florida, which in terms of today, has really become so much a part of the zeitgeist of the United States, and particularly in this moment. And you've had so many people moving there from other parts of the country. How important is Florida to our country?
Well, I think Florida, you're absolutely right, is kind of a bellwether state in this moment. Something a lot of the places that I did go in the book are places that for some moment in time, Americans, the rest of the world looked to that place to say, what's the future of America? What's the meaning of America? And I think if you were going to pick a place for the 21st century, for our own moment, one of those places might be Florida, not only because of Donald Trump's presence there, but because Florida has been so key to political shifts in recent years. And also because Florida is having this real kind of energy and economic boom. I actually do spend time in Florida because it gets very cold in Connecticut, as you know. And, one of the things that was fascinating to me when I was in Florida in January or February of just this past year is that Florida is building universities. Right.
Right.
And so up here in New England, right, we've got all these old universities, but nobody's making new universities. Whereas the Florida public education system is just growing and growing and trying to meet the needs of this ever changing and growing population. And it's really different. It's different to be in a place that is growing and changing that way than to be, where we spend our time, which is in the old part of the country.
Right. Right. You said that your Subaru broke down twice. Did you get a new car in the meantime?
No, I still have that Subaru. Actually, I just crossed the 100,000-mile mark, and so I tend to try to keep my cars until that
All
happens.
right.
But I think the next time something goes wrong with the Subaru, it gets no more money. It gets
All right.
traded in, and probably an electric vehicle is
All
coming.
right. Well, just a couple more questions, and particularly this one. Is the sun rising or setting on the American experiment? And you talked about the excitement of becoming, of trying, of falling and resting and trying again. But an experiment like ours, like the United States, does it ever end?
Well, there you're quoting first Ben Franklin, who asked that is the sun rising or setting question in the 1780s, right? Just as the Constitution's being created. And then 200 years ago, 200 years later, that second quote was from Lyndon Johnson, who said, what is America? It's this process of becoming, trying, failing. And I think that's as good a description of the United States as anything. I think the importance of Franklin's question really is just that Americans have been asking that question since the moment of their founding. There have been all sorts of moments when people thought the country was flying apart. It wasn't going to hold together, when they thought the country was entering a period of terminal decline, when it seemed like the past was better than the present, certainly better than the future. And so the fact that we're asking all of those questions now is not in itself unique. We might come up with different answers. This might really be the moment when it's all going to fall apart. But I think there is some comfort and some perspective in remembering
Yes.
how often those questions have been asked.
Right. So America's been around for 250 years. We've been asking those questions for 245 years, at least according to Benjamin Franklin. How, you teach history. How has your approach to teaching history or perspective on that changed in the last 10 years? Are your students asking different questions than they once were?
Well, one of the fun things about being a college professor is that you keep getting older, but they stay the same age, and so you get a little bit of a sense of kind of what each new generation knows, what their reference points are. I mean, it will be daunting to, I'm sure, many of your listeners to remember that this year's entering first year students were basically born in 2008. And so, they are pure products of the 21st century and have no living memory of even 9/11
Oh,
or of the financial crash, right? I mean, for many of them, probably their first living memory is the election, political memory, national memory is the election of Donald Trump in
yeah.
2016. And so it's interesting to be in that kind of dynamic relationship. That means that students are very interested in the history of the late 20th and early 21st century because to them it really is history. And so I have now crossed over in with the Reagan book and with a lot of my teaching to be teaching about periods of history that I lived through. And so that's quite different. And I think that I know, there's always the tendency to say, well, that's not what it was like. But then you actually have to do the real historical work on that front. The other thing that I've tried in recent years, this past fall, I teamed up with a couple of colleagues at Yale to teach a course called America at 250, a one-time class where we tried to do all 250 years of American history in one semester. And that was lots of fun because it was open for the undergrads, but we actually opened it to the New Haven community. And so there were several hundred members of the community who came to lecture twice a week, sat in on that. We did record it and it's up online if people
Wonderful. That
want to
was my
see it.
next
But
question.
yeah, so if you search for the Devane lectures, Devane, or just America at 250 Yale, you can find it on Yale's YouTube channel. So that was sort of the opposite, trying to do the big sweep story because particularly in this moment, I think a lot of people want to know that too.
Yeah. Well, Beverly, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. The book is called This Land is Your Land, a road trip through U.S. history. Any final thoughts? And how can people find out more about you and your upcoming works?
They can go to my Yale website. I'm on podcasts, probably Google. I'm not much of a social media person, so I'm not going to plug my X account or my Instagram. But yeah, I would say Google me and I'm easy to find.
All right. Well, this episode will be released on July 4th of 2026, so the exact 250th anniversary. And there's no better guest and no better expression to leave us with, and that is "This land is your land." All Across America is produced by me, Marco Vig, in Ridgefield, Connecticut. Visit us on Instagram at All Across America. Check out our website, allacrossamerica.com. There's an interactive map with all our episodes, and there's a Contact Us page where you can send your reactions, guest ideas, and suggestions. So get in touch, stay connected. To me, that's what podcasting is all about. Thanks for listening.